Summer of 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. More than 5,000 Japanese prisoners of war were held in American camps during the final months of World War II. The official American policy mandated humane treatment for the captives, in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, including recreational activities to maintain discipline and morale. The wooden bat felt strange in the calloused hands of Takeshi Morimoto. 3 months ago, these same hands had wielded a samurai sword in the jungles of Luzon. Now, under the relentless Wisconsin sun, the former sergeant of the Imperial Army watched as American soldiers laughed while explaining the rules of a game they called baseball. Japanese POWs never expected American soldiers would share baseball with them. It was not just a story about sports. It was about the moment when enemies discovered their shared humanity. Takeshi had no idea that afternoon would forever change his understanding of what it meant to be a prisoner of war. Camp McCoy woke up every morning to the same ritual of counting and ration distribution. Takeshi Morimoto stood at attention during roll call, his eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the barbed wire fences. The wind carried the acrid smell of creosote from the wooden posts, and the sweet scent of freshly cut grass that grew in the spaces between the barracks. His hands, once steady on the hilt of his katana, now trembled slightly as he held the metal cup that contained the watery morning coffee. The rough texture of the prisoner uniform irritated his skin, constantly reminding him of his new condition. Beside him, other Japanese soldiers maintained the same respectful silence, each lost in memories of distant battles and families left behind on the home islands. Hiro Tanaka, only 19 and captured in his first real battle, watched everything with curious eyes that still carried traces of the youth lost too soon. The boy had been instructed by the veterans to keep his head down and never make eye contact with the American guards. But his restless nature made him question every movement, every order, every routine established in the camp. The metallic sound of keys jangling on the belts of American soldiers echoed through the alleyways between the barracks, creating a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, marking the hours of the day. His young hands still carried calluses from the grenades he had learned to throw, but now they were busy folding and refolding the thin blanket that protected him from the Wisconsin cold of the early mornings. The rough texture of the American military fabric contrasted with the softness of the Japanese cotton he had known at home, yet another reminder that he was in enemy territory. Lieutenant Charles Donovan walked through the camp with measured steps, carefully observing the behavior of the prisoners under his charge. His superiors had been clear: maintain discipline without provoking incidents that could complicate the peace negotiations already underway in the diplomatic corridors. The smell of tobacco from his pipe mixed with the morning air, creating an aromatic cloud that followed him on his daily rounds. Donovan had served in the Pacific for 2 years and had seen enough of the Japanese ferocity to respect these men, even in captivity. His polished leather boots creaked softly against the damp grass, a sound that had become familiar to the prisoner's ears. The leather of his military gloves was worn from constant use, but he always kept them clean and well-maintained, a matter of professional pride he hadn't abandoned, even in that makeshift environment. The monotony of the days in camp created a silent tension that Donovan could feel growing among the prisoners. Proud and disciplined men like them weren't made for forced inactivity, and the lieutenant knew he needed to find ways to channel that repressed energy before it turned into something dangerous. The distant sound of an American radio playing music drifted toward them from the nearest guard tower, strange melodies that spoke of a world the prisoners could not comprehend. Donovan adjusted his military cap, feeling the familiar texture of the fabric against his sweaty forehead, and made a decision that would change the dynamic of the place. His eyes scanned the open field behind the barracks, a well-kept stretch of grass that could serve for something more than just morning exercises. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers growing beyond the fence, a reminder that life continued its natural course, even there, in that suspended space between war and peace. The silence of the camp was broken only by the sound of bare feet dragging across the dirt, and the occasional murmur of conversations in Japanese, kept at a respectfully low tone. Takeshi watched every movement of the American guards, looking for signs of a shift in routine that might indicate news of the war's end. The smell of carbolic soap used to clean the barracks mixed with the aroma of food being prepared in the camp kitchens, creating a unique atmosphere that would define his memories of that place. His hands clenched unconsciously, as if still holding invisible weapons, but the smooth texture of his empty palms constantly reminded him of his current powerlessness. Hiro walked beside him, trying to decipher the expressions on the faces of the American soldiers who passed by, looking for clues about their intentions. The sound of their breathing blended with the wind that rustled the American and Red Cross flags, flying at the center of the camp, symbols of a world they were still trying to understand. Something is changing in their routine, Takeshi whispered, watching Donovan move quickly toward the administrative offices, his steps more hurried than usual. The morning meeting of the American officers lasted longer than usual, and Takeshi could notice unusual movement in the administrative corridors through the fogged windows of the main building. The sound of raised voices in heated discussion reached the prisoners as a murmur, indistinct, but filled with an urgency that did not go unnoticed by the trained ears of the Japanese soldiers. The strong smell of coffee and American cigarettes seeped through the cracks of the doors, creating an atmosphere of tension that contrasted with the forced tranquility of the camp. Hiro nervously adjusted the collar of his prisoner uniform, feeling the rough texture of the American military cotton scratch his skin, still sensitive from his war wounds. His fingers tapped unconsciously against his thigh, a nervous tic he had developed since the capture that intensified whenever he sensed a shift in the established routine. The sound of the guards' boots echoed down the alleys with a different rhythm, faster, as if everyone walked with renewed purpose towards something the prisoners could not yet understand. When Donovan finally emerged from the administrative building, he carried under his arm a wooden box that none of the Japanese prisoners could identify from a distance. The lieutenant walked with determined steps toward the open field behind the barracks, followed by 3 American soldiers carrying strange objects wrapped in military canvas. The smell of machine oil impregnated the wooden box, mixing with the perfume of the wildflowers, creating a combination of scents that piqued even the curiosity of the most reserved prisoners. Takeshi furrowed his brow, trying to decipher the meaning of this unusual activity, his hands instinctively balling into fists as he watched each movement of the Americans. The rough texture of his calloused palms contrasted with the nervousness in his movements, betraying the anxiety he was trying to hide under a mask of military indifference. Hiro approached discreetly, his young eyes shining with curiosity that 3 months of captivity hadn't completely erased. The sound of his quickened breathing blending with the growing murmur of the other prisoners, who were beginning to gather to watch the spectacle. Donovan placed the wooden box in the center of the field and began pulling out objects that seemed to belong to some kind of sporting equipment. Polished wooden bats emerged first, their smooth surfaces reflecting the morning sunlight in a way that mesmerized the Japanese onlookers. The dry sound of the wood hitting the ground echoed across the field as Donovan aligned the bats in a row, followed by the soft rustle of leather balls being pulled from heavy canvas bags. The distinctive smell of tanned leather spread through the air, a fragrance that stirred confused memories in some prisoners who recalled similar equipment seen in American magazine photos. Takeshi approached slowly, maintaining a respectful distance but allowing himself to observe more closely those strange objects. His hands hesitated to reach out for one of the bats but quickly withdrew when he saw the movement, the imagined texture of the smooth wood remaining only as an unsatisfied curiosity. The morning breeze now carried a mixture of scents, leather, varnished wood, and the sweet fragrance of trampled grass, creating an entirely new atmosphere in that space, once dominated only by the institutional odors of the prisoner camp. The American interpreter, Sergeant Murphy, a second-generation Japanese-American who had volunteered for military service despite the prejudices of the time, walked to the center of the gathered prisoners. His fluent Japanese caused a murmur of surprise, as it was rare to hear their native language spoken with an American accent in such a hostile environment. Murphy explained that Lieutenant Donovan had proposed a recreational activity to relieve the tensions of confinement, a game called baseball, which could help pass the time in a productive way. The sound of his bilingual voice created an unexpected cultural bridge, his Japanese words tinged with American inflections that sounded strange, yet comforting to the prisoners' ears. Takeshi carefully observed the interpreter's facial expressions, looking for signs of deceit or manipulation, but found only genuine sincerity, mixed with a nearly childlike enthusiasm for the sport being introduced. The mental texture of distrust that he had carried for months began to slowly dissolve, replaced by a reluctant curiosity about the true intentions behind this seemingly generous gesture. Hiro, in turn, could not hide the sparkle of interest in his young eyes, his hands moving unconsciously, as if already holding one of those mysterious bats. The explanation of the basic rules of baseball flowed through Murphy's voice like water over stones, each concept carefully translated not just linguistically, but culturally adapted for minds accustomed to rigid military discipline. The field was divided into imaginary bases, marked by improvised sandbags that the American soldiers positioned with almost military precision. The smell of dry sand now mixed with the complex combination of scents that had already dominated the environment, adding an earthy note that reminded some prisoners of the beaches of their homeland. Donovan picked up one of the bats and demonstrated the proper hitting stance, his fluid movements revealing years of practice on American baseball fields. The sound of the bat slicing through the air created a sharp whistle that made several Japanese prisoners instinctively step back. But Takeshi remained firm, studying every aspect of the technique with the same intensity he had once devoted to perfecting his swordsmanship. The smooth texture of the bat in his imagined hands intrigued him, and he wondered what it would feel like to connect that polished wood with a moving ball, a challenge completely different from anything he had experienced in his 30 years of life. "This is an invitation, not an order," Murphy declared, carefully translating Donovan's carefully chosen words. "Anyone who wants to participate is welcome, and those who prefer can just observe." Hesitation hung over the group of prisoners like morning mist, each man internally weighing the implications of accepting or rejecting the seemingly generous invitation from their American captors. Takeshi remained motionless for long moments, his eyes scanning the faces of his comrades for clues about the collective decision that was silently forming through almost imperceptible glances and gestures. The smell of trampled grass intensified as some prisoners began to move hesitantly toward the equipment spread across the field, their bare feet creating a soft, rhythmic sound against the damp ground. Hiro was the first to truly venture forward, his young hands timidly reaching out to touch the smooth surface of a baseball, the texture of the tanned leather surprising him with its unexpected softness. The weight of the ball in his palm was unlike any projectile he had known in war, lighter than a grenade but denser than he expected, perfectly balanced in a way that piqued his curiosity about the engineering behind this seemingly simple object. Murphy watched closely, ready to translate any doubts or explain concepts that might be lost in the cultural barrier, still separating the Americans and Japanese in this makeshift space of mutual understanding. Donovan picked up a bat and assumed the batter's stance, his demonstrative movement slow and exaggerated to ensure that every detail of the technique was understood by the attentive observers. The sound of the bat cutting through the air in controlled arcs created a strange music that echoed across the field, a melody of wood and wind that began to break the tense silence that had dominated the space for months. Takeshi studied every aspect of the American stance, mentally comparing the principles of balance and timing with the fencing techniques he had mastered during years of rigorous military training. The visual texture of the demonstration fascinated him. There was an unexpected elegance in those movements that transcended the purely recreational function, revealing layers of complexity he hadn't anticipated in a simple American game. His hands moved involuntarily, mimicking Donovan's gestures with a precision that even surprised him, as if his body were already beginning to absorb a new form of physical discipline. The scent of the polished wood of the bats now mingled with the rising aroma of nervous sweat and anticipation, creating a unique atmosphere that would define this historic moment of genuine cultural contact between enemies at war. The first real attempt at the game began with Murphy gently tossing a ball toward Hiro, who held a bat with the intense concentration of someone handling a weapon for the first time. The sound of the ball passing through the air created a nearly hypnotic hiss that made all the observers hold their breath, while the young Japanese man tried to coordinate movements completely foreign to muscles trained only for combat. When the bat finally connected with the ball, The sharp crack that echoed across the field provoked an involuntary reaction of surprise and pleasure, even from the most reserved prisoners, who couldn't hide small smiles of approval. Takeshi watched the trajectory of the ball soaring toward the distant barracks, mentally calculating the physics involved in that impact and impressing himself with the simple efficiency of the lever system that allowed Hiro to send the projectile a considerable distance. The texture of discovery spread through the group like waves on water, each small individual success contributing to a growing atmosphere of collective fascination with that strangely satisfying activity. The scent of the sun-warmed leather intensified as more Japanese hands began to handle the balls, creating a familiar olfactory connection that helped diminish the sense of cultural alienation that had dominated the first moments of the experience. Donovan then demonstrated the rules for running between bases, his measured steps creating a path that transformed that patch of grass into a territory of completely new possibilities for men who had only known the rigid confines of captivity. The sound of his military boots marking each improvised base echoed like a Morse code of conditional freedom, explaining through movement that there were spaces for mobility even within the restrictions of captivity. Takeshi mentally followed each step of the demonstration, mapping out the distances and calculating the time necessary to complete the circuit with maximum efficiency, his military mind automatically transforming recreation into strategy. The texture of the grass under his bare feet when he finally decided to attempt the run was a sensory revelation that momentarily transported him beyond the barbed wire, creating an illusion of freedom that lasted only the seconds it took to complete that small diamond of hope drawn on the ground. Murphy ran alongside the prisoners during their attempts, shouting encouragement in Japanese mixed with English, his voice creating a bilingual soundtrack for this first experience of voluntary cooperation between captors and captives. The scent of American sweat mixed with Japanese created a new chemistry in the air, a fragrance of shared effort that began to dissolve some of the invisible barriers separating two warring worlds. The afternoon passed slowly as more prisoners joined the activity, some still hesitant, but unable to resist the magnetism of those genuine laughs that began to echo through the field like music long forgotten. The sound of the balls being tossed and hit created a rhythm almost tribal in nature, as if it awakened ancestral memories of games and competitions that predated all wars and ideologies. Takeshi finally accepted holding a bat, the texture of the polished wood against his calloused palms, creating an unexpected connection with that foreign culture he had only known through bullets and explosions. His first attempts at hitting were awkward, but they revealed a familiar determination that even impressed Donovan, who recognized in the former Japanese sergeant's stance the same fierce discipline that had made these soldiers formidable adversaries on the Pacific battlefields. Hiro, in turn, demonstrated a natural talent for the sport that surprised everyone, his youthful movements adapting quickly to the technical demands of baseball, with an ease that drew spontaneous applause from both Americans and Japanese. The texture of camaraderie began to slowly form, woven by the invisible threads of healthy competition and mutual recognition of skill and effort. Perhaps, thought Takeshi as he watched Hiro run between the bases with a genuine smile on his face, there are forms of honor that do not involve dying for the emperor. The midday sun turned the makeshift field into a stage where different worlds began to converge through the universal language of competitive sport. Takeshi had overcome his initial hesitations and now held the bat with growing confidence, his muscles gradually adapting to the movements required by this sport, completely foreign to his previous military experiences. The smell of heated earth mixed with the aroma of sweat shared between Americans and Japanese, creating an atmosphere of collective effort that transcended the linguistic and cultural barriers still present in this space of forced coexistence. Murphy continued translating not only words, but also the emotional nuances of the game, explaining how American baseball valued both individual strategy and team cooperation. The texture of cultural discovery deepened with each successful play, each connection between bat and ball representing a small bridge built between two worldviews that had seemed irreconcilable only a few hours before. The sound of American applause for Japanese successes echoed across the field like new music, an improbable harmony that defied all expectations of how enemies should interact in times of war. Donovan watched closely as events unfolded, satisfied to see how his seemingly simple initiative was producing results that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The American lieutenant recognized in Takeshi's movements the same precision and dedication that had made Japanese soldiers such respectable adversaries, qualities that were now manifesting in the ex-sergeant's determination to master the techniques of baseball. The texture of transformation was almost palpable. In the air, men who had once faced each other mortally in distant jungles now shared genuine laughs while celebrating well-executed hits and spectacular runs between improvised bases. The scent of wildflowers growing beyond the fence seemed more intense that afternoon, as if nature itself conspired to bless this moment of rediscovered humanity amidst the chaos of World War. Hiro had become a kind of natural sports prodigy, his sharp, youthful reflexes allowing him to execute plays that even the most experienced American soldiers in baseball found impressive. The sound of his spontaneous laughter when he completed his first full run around all the bases created an emotional resonance that touched hearts hardened by months of tension and mutual distrust. As the hours passed, small mixed groups of Americans and Japanese began to form naturally, united by their shared interest in perfecting techniques and strategies for this fascinating game that revealed increasing layers of complexity. Takeshi found himself involved in a gestured discussion with an American soldier about the physics of curveballs, his hands tracing trajectories in the air as he tried to understand how the ball's rotation could alter its flight direction so dramatically. The language barrier forced them both to resort to expressive physical communication, which revealed surprising similarities in their ways of processing complex technical information. The scent of the sun-warmed leather of the balls mixed with the tobacco aroma from American pipes and Japanese cigarettes, creating an atmosphere of informal camaraderie that sharply contrasted with the military formality that had dominated all previous interactions in the camp. Murphy translated fragments of more complex conversations, but realized that the true communication was happening through smiles, gestures of approval, and mutual recognition of athletic skill that transcended nationalities and ideologies. The texture of the afternoon was changing, transforming from a cautious experiment into something that was beginning to seem genuinely fun for all participants. As the sun began to set on the Wisconsin horizon, Donovan gathered the Americans and Japanese into an informal circle around the scattered baseball equipment. Through Murphy, he explained that this activity could become a regular routine in the camp, a way to keep everyone physically active and mentally occupied during the uncertain weeks that still lay ahead before the official end of the war. The sound of approval that rose from the mixed group was unanimous, a vocal harmony that represented the first genuine moment of consensus between captors and captives since the establishment of the prisoner camp. Takeshi was surprised to realize that he was eagerly anticipating the next game, his mind already planning strategies to improve his batting technique and better understand the tactical subtleties of this American sport. The texture of anticipation was completely different from anything he had experienced during months of captivity. For the first time, the immediate future offered something beyond the oppressive monotony of prison routine. Hiro was radiant, his eyes sparkling with the kind of youthful enthusiasm the war had prematurely stolen from his personality, but which baseball had begun to restore through the simple joy of competition without deadly consequences. The game session ended with an improvised ceremony where Donovan and Takeshi shook hands in a symbolic demonstration of mutual respect, observed in respectful silence by all those present. The sound of that handshake echoed symbolically far beyond its physical reach, representing a historic moment where enemies acknowledged their shared humanity through the universal language of sport. The scent of the trampled grass under their feet now mixed with the perfume of the evening, creating an olfactory memory that would forever mark that day in the minds of all participants. Murphy translated Takeshi's words of thanks, expressing his surprise and gratitude for the opportunity to discover a facet of American culture completely different from anything he had known through wartime propaganda. The texture of that final moment carried the weight of genuine reconciliation, a tacit promise that perhaps there were paths to peace that didn't require the total defeat of one side in conflict. As the participants slowly dispersed toward their respective barracks and guard posts, the field remained marked by the improvised bases and the trampled grass that had witnessed the birth of an improbable mutual understanding between men who had, not long before, been mortal enemies. "When we return to Japan," Hiro whispered to Takeshi as they walked back to the barracks, "we will teach this game to our children, so they know not all Americans are demons. Like we were taught." The weeks following the first game transformed the prisoner camp into something completely different from any military installation Takeshi had known during his years of service. The morning sound of the whistle calling for the routine roll call was now followed by the cheerful noise of balls being tossed against the walls of the barracks, where the Japanese practiced their batting technique even before the official breakfast. The characteristic scent of sun-warmed leather had spread throughout the camp, a fragrance now as familiar as the aroma of boiled rice coming from the American kitchens, adapted to prepare meals more palatable to the Oriental prisoners. Hiro had become something of an informal celebrity among both groups, his natural skill for baseball earning genuine admiration even from the most experienced American soldiers in the sport. The texture of daily life had fundamentally changed. Where before there had only been the oppressive monotony of waiting, now there was the excited anticipation of the afternoon games, which had become the highlight of each day. Murphy observed with satisfaction how his role as interpreter had naturally expanded to include translating baseball terminology and American expressions that the prisoners eagerly absorbed. Takeshi discovered that his methodical approach to learning, forged by years of rigorous military discipline, applied perfectly to mastering the technical nuances of American baseball. His free mornings were dedicated to the obsessive study of pitching mechanics, his eyes analyzing each movement of the American soldiers with the same intensity he had once reserved for combat tactics. The sound of his controlled breathing during warm-up exercises echoed through the corridors between the barracks, a familiar rhythm that reassured the other prisoners, who recognized in that breathing pattern the same determination that had sustained them through desperate battles in the Pacific. The rough texture of the bat in his calloused hands had become comfortable, almost intimate, as if that polished piece of wood were a natural extension of his arms, trained to wield weapons. Donovan often approached to observe Takeshi's morning exercises. Impressed with the dedication the former Japanese sergeant applied to every aspect of the game, from the batting stance to the precise timing required to connect with balls pitched at increasing speeds. The scent of the waxed wood of the bats mingled with the smell of concentrated sweat, creating an atmosphere of a craft workshop where skills were forged through obsessive repetition and the constant refinement of techniques. The afternoon games had evolved from cautious experiments to genuinely competitive matches that attracted spectators from all over the camp, including guards who had initially kept their distance due to military protocol. Murphy found that his translation skills were constantly challenged by the linguistic creativity that emerged when Americans and Japanese tried to communicate complex strategies through cultural and idiomatic barriers. The sound of tactical discussions had become a unique polyglot music, where expressive gestures and diagrams drawn in the dirt replaced words when verbal communication failed. Takeshi had formed an unlikely partnership with Sergeant Bobby Chen, an American soldier of Chinese descent, who shared with the Japanese man an intuitive understanding of the physical and mental nuances required for the precise execution of complex plays. The texture of the mutual trust that developed between them completely transcended the historical animosities between their countries of origin, revealing how shared interests could build bridges over political chasms that seemed insurmountable. Hiro, in turn, had become the unofficial protege of several American baseball veterans, who recognized in his natural talent an opportunity to pass on knowledge accumulated over decades of practice on fields scattered across America. The scent of the trampled grass during spectacular plays mingled with tobacco and sweat, creating a unique fragrance that defined those afternoons of mutual cultural discovery. The nights at the camp had taken on a completely new dynamic when informal groups began to gather for discussions on advanced baseball techniques which often evolved into broader conversations about the cultural differences between America and Japan. Takeshi found himself sharing stories about his childhood in Kyoto, with American soldiers who never imagined that an enemy could have memories so similar to their own youthful experiences. The sound of mixed voices, guttural Japanese intertwined with nasal English, created a linguistic harmony that defied all expectations of how prisoners and captors should interact during military conflicts. Murphy worked tirelessly to facilitate these conversations, discovering that translation was not just about converting words between languages, but also about finding cultural reference points that allowed for genuine understanding between seemingly incompatible worlds. The texture of these nightly interactions was completely different from the rigid formality that had characterized the first months of the camp. Now, there was a careful intimacy that allowed the sharing of human vulnerabilities without compromising the military dignity both sides considered essential. Donovan watched these meetings from a respectful distance, satisfied to realize that his seemingly simple initiative had catalyzed transformations that extended far beyond the original scope of simply keeping the prisoners occupied and physically active. The scent of the night cicadas mingled with the aroma of shared cigarettes, creating an atmosphere of international camaraderie that would have been unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. Weekends had become special occasions where more elaborate games were organized, with mixed teams of Americans and Japanese competing in impromptu tournaments that generated genuine excitement among all participants and spectators. Takeshi had naturally assumed a leadership role among the prisoners, his previous military authority transforming into influence based on respect earned through athletic excellence and exemplary dedication to technical improvement. The sound of applause echoing during spectacular plays had become a regular soundtrack of the camp, replacing the oppressive silence that had characterized the first months of the prison facility's operation. Hiro thrived in this environment of friendly competition, his youthful and naturally optimistic personality finding expression through athletic performances that impressed even the most experienced American baseball veterans with decades of experience. The texture of the collective celebration that emerged after particularly thrilling games created moments of pure human joy that completely transcended the extraordinary historical circumstances that had brought those men to that specific place. Murphy found that his services as an interpreter were less necessary during the games themselves, as the participants had developed a gestural and emotional language that communicated intentions and celebrated successes regardless of linguistic barriers. The scent of victory, a mixture of sweat, trampled grass, and collective satisfaction, had become a familiar fragrance that defined the best moments of those afternoons, of mutual discovery between cultures that were finding their fundamental similarities through the universal language of competitive sport. "I never thought," Takeshi confessed to Murphy during a pause between innings, "that I would find honor in a game that doesn't involve life or death, but there's something about baseball that awakens the same warrior spirit that sustained us in battle." The August morning arrived, charged with an electric tension that Takeshi recognized immediately, his sharp military instincts detecting subtle changes in the atmosphere of the camp that inevitably preceded important news about the course of the war. The familiar sound of American radios playing morning music was replaced by deep, urgent voices broadcasting information that he couldn't fully comprehend, but whose somber tone stirred a familiar anxiety he had learned to associate with significant military developments. The smell of strong coffee escaping from the administrative offices now carried a more pronounced acidity, as if the very drink reflected the growing tension among the American officers who were holding longer and more frequent conferences than usual. Hiro nervously watched the closed expressions of the American guards during the morning roll call, his young eyes searching for clues about imminent changes in the established routine that had become so precious to all the prisoners. The texture of concern spread across the camp like morning fog, an almost tangible presence that affected even those trying to maintain their normal activities of preparing for the afternoon baseball games. Murphy seemed particularly disturbed, his usually confident movements replaced by a restlessness he couldn't entirely hide from the prisoners, who had learned to read his facial expressions as reliable indicators of the general mood among the Americans. Donovan emerged from the administrative building with an expression that Takeshi immediately recognized as the professional mask that military officers assume when they need to deliver difficult news to their subordinates. The American lieutenant walked with heavier steps than usual, carrying documents under his arm that clearly contained news that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the prisoner camp. The sound of his military boots against the ground seemed amplified by the unnatural silence that overtook the space, as the prisoners realized that something important was about to be announced. The texture of collective apprehension was almost palpable, a tension that transformed the usual anticipation for the afternoon games into an anxiety focused exclusively on the words Donovan was about to speak through Murphy. The smell of wet grass mixed with the scent of official documents created an olfactory combination that reminded Takeshi of the eve of important battles, when orders arrived from higher-ups, completely altering previously established plans and expectations. Hiro instinctively positioned himself closer to Takeshi, his youthful instincts seeking the safety of the more experienced veteran's presence during moments of uncertainty that evoked traumatic memories of his capture in the Philippine jungles months before. The scent of wildflowers, which normally brought peace to the environment, now seemed laden with a melancholic premonition that made several prisoners gaze longingly beyond the fences, toward horizons that represented distant and uncertain homes. Murphy translated Donovan's words with a voice that tried to maintain professional neutrality but betrayed complex emotions that reflected his own unique situation as an American of Japanese descent, serving as a bridge between two conflicting worlds. The news was fragmented but deeply disturbing. Something extraordinary had happened in Japan, something that Donovan's superiors described only as significant developments that could accelerate the end of hostilities. The sound of the translated words echoed through the camp like distant thunder, carrying implications that the prisoners tried to decipher through facial expressions and tones of voice, more than through the specific content of the limited information being shared. Takeshi felt a familiar chill in his stomach, the same sensation he had experienced before receiving orders for particularly dangerous missions, a visceral intuition that fundamental changes were approaching, regardless of his will or preparation. The texture of uncertainty thickened like fog, enveloping every man present in an atmosphere of tense expectation that transformed the familiar space into an emotionally unknown territory. Hiro hesitantly asked about their families in Japan, but Murphy could only shake his head with an expression that mixed genuine sympathy with frustration for being unable to offer more specific or comforting information. The smell of fear, a subtle blend of cold sweat and rapid breathing, began to mix with the usual aromas of the camp, creating an atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the carefree joy that had characterized the previous weeks. The baseball game scheduled for that afternoon took place under a completely different emotional shadow than any previous experience, each movement laden with an intensity that transcended the sport to touch on deeper questions of destiny and uncertain future. Takeshi gripped the bat too tightly, his muscles tense, reflecting an anxiety that manifested through every poorly calculated swing and every run executed with an urgency unrelated to the rules of the game. The sound of the ball connecting with the bat seemed different that afternoon, drier and less musical, as if even that familiar noise was tainted by the tension that dominated every aspect of life in the camp. The American soldiers participated in the game with a forced enthusiasm that couldn't fully mask their own anxiety about developments that clearly affected them as much as the prisoners, creating an atmosphere of artificial camaraderie that contrasted with the genuine naturalness of previous interactions. The texture of forced fun was uncomfortable for everyone involved, a collective performance attempting to maintain normalcy in circumstances that had become anything but normal. Murphy translated less during the game, as if words had lost their ability to build bridges between worlds that suddenly seemed to be drifting apart again. Despite all the personal connections established over weeks of harmonious coexistence, Hiro executed his plays with perfect mechanics, but without the spontaneous joy that had characterized his previous performances, his movements revealing a premature maturity forced by the growing understanding that this period of cultural discovery was coming to an end. regardless of any participant's wishes. The smell of trampled grass now mixed with the aroma of imminent farewell, a melancholic fragrance that would define the memories of that day for all those present. As the sun set that afternoon, heavy with forebodings, the participants dispersed with unusual slowness, as if reluctant to end what might be one of the last normal games they would share in that space, which had become much more than just a prisoner camp. Takeshi remained on the field even after the others had left, his eyes scanning the improvised bases and scattered equipment on the grass as if trying to memorize every detail of a scene he sensed was about to change dramatically. The sound of the night wind swaying the barbed wire fence seemed laden with whispers of imminent change, a natural soundtrack for reflections on the transient nature of moments of harmony amidst historical chaos. Murphy silently approached and stood beside Takeshi for several minutes without speaking, both understanding that certain emotions transcended the need for translation or verbal explanation. The texture of the shared silence conveyed more genuine communication than any conversation could have at that specific moment, a communion of anxiety and anticipatory nostalgia that united American and Japanese through their shared humanity. Hiro eventually joined them, creating a human triangle that symbolically represented the intercultural connections that baseball had made possible, but now seemed threatened by much larger historical forces than any individual will. The approaching night carried with it the scent of change and farewell, fragrances that blended with the olfactory memory of happier afternoons, when the future seemed promising, and newly formed friendships appeared lasting and secure. "It doesn't matter what happens," murmured Takeshi in Japanese, his words being translated by Murphy more for his own emotional benefit than for communication. "I will always remember that there are Americans who share baseball with Japanese prisoners." The month of August brought with it winds laden with news that would definitively alter the course of world history, and Takeshi could feel the approach of monumental changes through subtle signs that his military experience had taught him to interpret long before any official announcement. The sound of American radios had completely changed in character, now broadcasting special programs that interrupted regular programming with a frequency indicating extraordinary developments of national importance. The smell of urgency filled the air of the camp, a mixture of overconsumed coffee, cigarette smoke, and the metallic scent of tension that precedes fundamental historical revelations. Hiro watched closely every movement of the American soldiers, his young eyes recording changes in body language and facial expressions, suggesting that the end of their captivity was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. The texture of expectation had transformed into something almost unbearable, an emotional pressure that affected even the most routine activities in the camp, including the baseball games that continued to happen, but under an entirely different atmosphere than in the previous weeks. Murphy seemed burdened with information he could not share, his frustration visible when prisoners asked about their families in Japan, questions he was not authorized to answer with the honesty the friendships formed in the camp deserved. Donovan walked through the corridors between the barracks with steps that revealed the weight of responsibilities that transcended his routine administrative function, carrying documents that clearly contained instructions on procedures for situations no military manual had fully anticipated. The morning of August 15th dawned with an exceptional clarity that dramatically contrasted with the fog of uncertainty that had dominated the camp in the previous weeks, as if the sky itself were preparing the stage for revelations that would permanently alter the lives of everyone present in that unlikely place of cultural encounter. Donovan called for a general assembly on the baseball field, significantly choosing that space that had become a symbol of the human connections established between enemies who had discovered their capacity for cooperation and mutual respect. The sound of footsteps converging from all directions across the field created a symphony of expectation, echoing like a prelude to a historic moment that everyone sensed was about to unfold. The texture of history in motion was almost tangible in the morning air, a sensation that made every man present intuitively understand that they were participating in something much greater than their individual experiences of captivity and cultural discovery. Murphy positioned himself beside Donovan with an expression that blended relief and melancholy, preparing to translate words that would finally answer the questions that had been tormenting the Japanese prisoners for weeks. The smell of the morning grass mixed with the aroma of the official documents Donovan held, creating an olfactory combination that would forever mark that moment in the memory of everyone present. Takeshi and Hiro positioned themselves in the front row of the assembled prisoners, their expressions revealing a complex mix of hope and apprehension about news that could mean freedom, but also confrontation with the realities of their country's fate. Donovan's words, translated meticulously by Murphy, echoed across the field like the reverberations of a new era being born through Japan's unconditional surrender and the official end of all hostilities. In World War II, the sound of the translation, being absorbed by the prisoners, created waves of reaction that spread through the group like concentric circles in water, each man individually processing the implications of information that simultaneously represented personal freedom and national defeat. Takeshi received the news with the stoic dignity that had characterized his entire military career, but his eyes revealed for a moment the emotional depth of a man confronting the end of everything that had defined his identity during decades of service to the emperor. The texture of American victory mixed with Japanese defeat created an emotionally complex atmosphere that defied simple categorization, especially considering the genuine friendships that had developed between captors and captives during months of coexistence in the camp. Hiro reacted with tears he didn't try to hide, his youth allowing for a more direct emotional expression about the relief of surviving the war and the possibility of eventually returning to Japan to rebuild a life interrupted by early military conscription. Murphy visibly struggled with his own emotions while continuing to translate details about repatriation procedures that would transform that temporary camp into a final step before the prisoners returned to their civilian lives in post-war Japan. The scent of wildflowers seemed more intense that morning, as if nature itself conspired to bless that moment of historical transition with its most delicate and comforting beauty. Donovan announced that there would be a final baseball game that afternoon, a symbolic celebration of the human connections that had transcended the extraordinary circumstances that had brought Americans and Japanese together in that patch of grass in Wisconsin. The proposal was met with unanimous approval, revealing how the sport had become much more than simple recreation, transforming into a universal language through which men of different cultures expressed mutual respect and recognition of their shared humanity. The sound of preparations for the final game created an atmosphere of melancholic celebration, where the joy of imminent freedom mixed with the sadness of friendships that would be interrupted by repatriation and permanent geographical separation. Takeshi dedicated the morning to teaching advanced batting techniques to American soldiers who had become interested in his methodological approach to athletic improvement, a transfer of knowledge that symbolically represented the positive cultural exchange baseball had made possible. The texture of those last hours of coexistence was laden with meaning that transcended any previous experience of farewell, as everyone understood that they had witnessed something historically unique that would likely never be repeated in their lives. Hiro organized an impromptu autograph session where Americans and Japanese signed baseballs that would serve as physical reminders of the friendships formed in circumstances no diplomatic manual could have foreseen or planned. The scent of the leather balls mixed with the aroma of ink from pens, creating a fragrance of farewell that would define the memories of that day for all participants in the informal closing ceremonies. The final game took place under a setting sun that bathed the field in golden light, transforming that ordinary space into a theatrical stage where the final act of a human drama unfolded, demonstrating the capacity for transcendence through sport and mutual cultural discovery. Takeshi performed his best athletic performance in baseball, as if he wanted to leave a lasting impression of competence and dedication that honored the American friendships that had welcomed him as an equal, despite his status as a prisoner of war. The sound of mixed applause, Americans cheering Japanese successes and vice versa, echoed across the field like music of international harmony, dramatically contrasting with the cacophony of hatred that had dominated the previous years of global conflict. Murphy openly cried during his final translations of the game, his emotion reflecting not only personal relief at the end of the war, but also recognition that he had participated in something historically significant. that had changed his own perspective on the possibilities of reconciliation between warring peoples. The texture of the final celebration carried tones of anticipatory nostalgia, with all participants intuitively understanding that they were experiencing irreplaceable moments that would become precious memories held for decades. Hero stood out in the final game with a spectacular performance that earned prolonged applause from both Americans and Japanese, his youth and natural talent serving as a symbol of hope for the possibilities of rebuilding and renewal in the post-war world that was beginning to take shape. Donovan actively participated in the game for the first time, abandoning his official reserve to play alongside men who had once been enemies but had become companions through the universal language of respectful athletic competition. The scent of shared victory, a mixture of sweat, trampled grass, and collective satisfaction, defined that afternoon as the perfect closure to an experience that demonstrated how small gestures of humanity can blossom even in the most improbable circumstances. The individual goodbyes that followed the final game carried an emotional weight that surprised even those who had witnessed the gradual evolution of relationships in the camp during months of increasingly harmonious coexistence. Takeshi and Donovan exchanged a handshake that lasted several seconds longer than the usual military protocol, their eyes communicating mutual recognition of the historical importance of their interaction, which had completely transcended the official roles of captor and prisoner. Murphy received warm hugs from Japanese prisoners, who expressed gratitude not only for his translation services, but also for his patience and cultural sensitivity, which had made possible the construction of genuine bridges between seemingly incompatible worlds. The sound of promises of future correspondence mixed with the barely concealed tears of men who had discovered friendship in places where they had expected only hostility and distrust. The texture of the final goodbyes was imbued with historical significance that everyone present intuitively understood, a consciousness that they had participated in something that future historians would study as an example of humanity triumphing over adverse circumstances. Hiro promised to teach baseball in Japan and dedicate future games to the memory of the Americans who had shown him that enemies could become friends through simple gestures of generosity and cultural inclusion. The smell of tears mixed with the fragrance of evening flowers created a scent of farewell that would forever mark the end of that extraordinary chapter in the lives of all the men who discovered their shared humanity through bats, balls, and the universal magic of competition without deadly consequences. "When my grandchildren ask me about the war," said Takeshi in his final farewell, translated by Murphy for his own emotional benefit more than for communication, "I will tell them about American soldiers who taught us that honor can also be found in games that celebrate life instead of death."